Welcome once again, my dear ThoughtVolutionists, to another soul-enhancing episode of ThoughtVolution, where every conversation is an exploration of the human experience, filled with depth, vulnerability, and profound insights. I'm your gracious host, Stefan Dubiel, and today I am honored to introduce you to a remarkable individual whose journey embodies perseverance, wisdom, and the unyielding pursuit of authenticity. I hope you're enjoying a beautiful day wherever you may be. Sit back, relax, wind down, maybe drink a glass of wine or water, and listen to another captivating story told by a truly amazing fellow human being. Rachael, a true ray of light in a world often clouded by darkness, has traversed the depths of her own soul, emerging with a profound sense of purpose and the irrevocable commitment to living life on her own terms. Born and raised in Missouri, Rachael's story is one of complexity and nuance, a tapestry woven from the threads of her bicultural upbringing, her adventures abroad in France, and her experiences as a single parent to her beloved twins. But Rachael's journey is not defined solely by her external adventures. It is her inner landscape, rich with introspection and self-discovery, that truly sets her apart. As a dyslexic, possibly ADHD, and profoundly self-aware individual, Rachael has navigated the winding paths of her own mind with grace and resilience, embracing her unique quirks and challenges as integral parts of her identity. Through the highs and lows of life, Rachael's spirit remains undaunted, fueled by a deep-seated ambition to grow, to learn, and to connect with others on a soul-deep level. Her journey of divorce, reframing societal norms, and fostering sacred self-awareness stand as testaments to her courage, her authenticity, and her unwavering faith in the goodness of humanity. As we embark on this conversation with Rachael, let us open our hearts and minds to the wisdom she so generously shares. May her stories of love, loss, and redemption inspire us to embrace our own journeys with grace and compassion, knowing that in the darkness, there's always a glimmer of light waiting to guide us wherever in the world it is that we belong. This is ThoughtVolution, where every story is a testament to the indestructible capacity of the human spirit and the transformative power of vulnerability. Join us as we delve into the depths of the human experience, one conversation at a time. Hey, Rachael, thank you so much for being here today. Now, as somebody who has lived in different places, experienced different cultures, somebody who grew up in a bicultural environment, what is your life like based on that? How did that impact how you live your life now?
That's such a good, fun question. So I'll go back to growing up. I'll start there. And I remember this moment when I was around 12 or 13. And I so loved, I don't know how much I actually realized that I was bicultural, right? But around 12 or 13, I really had this strong desire to connect with my British side of the family. And not just my family, but the heritage. And I would try to do a British accent. And of course, I grew up with a father who that was his accent. And I didn't realize he had an accent. But we would go to England regularly. And so I would try to use this accent. And I could say a few things like, "You're right, Doc. Wish you were, son." So it's a Derbyshire accent. It's from a certain part of England. And they laughed at me and they made fun of me. And I just remember being so devastated that I felt like I was being rejected from that part of who I was. And then, of course, you fast forward years later to where I'm at now, and I don't worry about it anymore. I'm American, but I'm also partly British. And it has, I would say it's really opened up my world in wonderful, wonderful ways. I've been to a number of countries, different things like that. And for me, it just adds such a richness to my life that I wouldn't trade. So even though there was that rough spot for me that was like this kind of identity crisis at such a young age that I processed through and then got to where I'm at now. And I love just the different cultures. And my dad said to me one time, he goes, "You're very international. You're of the world, like the whole world." Because I just soak in all the cultures and I embrace all the little idiosyncrasies, and I take the good and I let go of the other things. And I enjoy it so much, especially I know you already know that even though I grew up with that bicultural side, I then lived abroad for a while and did all kinds of things that I don't know, it just makes my life feel very rich.
I love that. Now, here's a tricky one. How do you
Okay.
think your view of our country here in the United States and the world differs from the American who's never been outside of the country?
My first thought is there's a lot of different of Americans. And I would say that culture is everywhere. And I grew up in the Midwest, still in the Midwest. And I remember someone making a comment about us not having culture. And I'm like, no, that's because you're thinking that because there is a certain type of culture that you like a lot, and you consider that very cultured. But that doesn't mean that there isn't still culture. The culture of the Midwest is going to be a very different culture than the East Coast, the West Coast. And then you also look at socioeconomic stratas, like even though we try not to have separation of classes in like a traditional way that would have been existing in India or something like that. This very clear cut is what I'm trying to say. We don't have that, and yet it still exists. And you go to different people groups, you go to different cultures, like even within the US, we have all this variety. So when I think about that question about how my views differ, I think it also varies drastically by the Americans that we're talking about. And when I look at America, I see a lot of good things. And I'm aware of the shortcomings, but I've been in other countries. I've spent quite a bit of time in other countries. And I'm like, well, they've got them too. So maybe they're better at this thing over here and we're not. But maybe we're better at this piece over here. Like we talk about, and I know this is a hot topic, but we talk about racism and prejudice. I'm like, prejudice exists everywhere. It might shift who the target is, but it exists. And it's not something that's unique to one nation or one ethnicity. So things like that, I think that I look at it and I look at America and I see a lot of freedom that I think people don't realize they have.
I agree. And I think part of it also is we often tend to do this finger pointing thing, right? We say, oh,
Hmm.
if you're German, you're a perfectionist. Well, there are many moments where I'm really not a perfectionist at all. Or if you are this and that culture, then this must be your characteristics. And what we often forget is that people are individuals and that no person is alike another person. And I mean, you're raising twins, and I'm very sure that one twin is very unlike the other in some ways. I
Absolutely.
I think what we need to start doing as people more is to actually learn from each other again. I think we've kind of stopped having that type of communication where we say, "Oh, if a particular country does something very well, how about we pick up on that and we try to learn from that and we try to adapt? And I wish we did that more. I wish we actually saw the
Yeah.
world as a melting pot of all of our
Mm.
cultures, because no matter where you live, you'll meet people who have been abroad, who have traveled. You'll meet people who have lived elsewhere, and they bring their mindset to the table. They bring their experience to the table, just as much as a person who may have never been out of the country, but who's maybe more connected to the culture that they grew up in.
Yeah.
Now, how has your traveling and you having lived abroad, how has that impacted your parenting?
Mm. Yeah. So I would say that I probably grew up not very typical American. I think I don't think of myself as a non-typical American because my mom and her family are American, although they also traveled a lot as well. My grandpa was a petroleum engineer, and they lived in Australia for a few years. They lived in Algeria briefly. They lived in England. That's where my parents ended up meeting. I think just that I probably had a different upbringing already to begin with, right? And then you add in, so my mom already has different views and has experienced the world in different ways. And then you add in the fact that I have a father from another country as well, and then who has also done some pretty amazing things and traveled to other countries. So I think though you take those things and then you add in like these other pieces, and then you add in the fact that I lived abroad and I've traveled abroad, and I've also traveled a lot of the states. So just this kind of like awareness that the little pocket where I'm living isn't the only experience. And I do a lot of things that are very, I would say, probably rather French, even though I find it humorous because I lived in France for about 2.5 years, over two different times. And I wasn't spending lots of time with French people parenting. I was getting my master's degree, and then the second time I was just working. I was married at the time. So it's kind of interesting that I look at this kind of treat you as an adult, which I don't even know that the French totally do that because I haven't been around tons of French people raising children. But I started to read a book. I never finished it. Confessions. Raising Bébé. It's it's an international couple who were living in France. She might be American. I don't remember if she's American or British. And just talking about the different interactions, like the baby conforms to your life. The child conforms to your life and is integrated into your life, as opposed to this viewpoint where everything that you do now turns to focus on the baby and you conform to the baby. And I don't think I even realized that that was a more American thing. I still do a lot for my kids that's probably more in an American vein. I suppose I don't think about it very often. But we do speak French together. I try not to speak English with them. And of course, they're also around my parents and my father. So they're getting this exposure to other cultures that way as well. And then we have already been to other countries. We've been to two other countries and a number of states. So I would say it's had probably quite a big impact. Things I don't necessarily think about. I don't prioritize sports over well, if they want to try them, I encourage them to do it, and I think it's great to try things at least once. But I'm not pushing them, I would say, compared to a lot of Americans, even if they're not pushing their kids. Like, my kids are just not doing near as many sports and stuff. If they were interested, I'd be very happy to support that. But we also spend probably more time in the arts and creativity, which I'm sure there are lots of Americans who do that as well. but it's not the stereotypical image I think that we have.
I can very much relate to that because I have had friends tell me that my parenting style is slightly different. And the goal of parenting for me is to raise my children to be independent, to
Yeah,
start living their own lives pretty early on. That doesn't mean that,
agreed.
anything goes and they can just run wild. But I think part of it also is that I feel like a lot of my friends here, they feel like they need to shield their children from failure all the time. And I actually, this sounds really mean, but I want my children to fail. Not in a bad way. Don't worry. I'm not a mean guy. But
Yeah.
failure teaches you. And I feel like if you're constantly trying to shield your child from making mistakes, from doing the wrong thing every now and then, you're not really teaching them the consequence and the important part, which is taking responsibility for your actions. And
Yes.
that's something that I really like as a parenting approach. There was an interesting video that I saw a while back, and it was this woman from the United States who lived in Germany, and she was talking about how parents in Germany will send their kids to school at like the age of 6 or 7 by themselves in the morning, and they walk to
Mhm.
school alone. And that this was a huge culture shock for her to just see how these little kids
Yeah.
were alone on the bus, alone on the tram, walking around alone. Can you share any culture shocks that you may have experienced during your travels? Anything that perhaps made you feel out of place or
Mm.
startled you for a little bit?
Yeah, and actually, before I do that, I do want to just comment that the point you made about letting them fail, I think it's really important because you're giving them a safe place to fall on their face. And they will fall on their faces. It's going to happen
Yeah.
at some point in their lives. It will happen. And I would rather my kids have the opportunity to learn about the impact of consequences where the risk is low because I'm not going to make fun of them. I'm not going
Yeah, I
to
agree.
whatever. So I just want to affirm that. And I know, and I think it's Dr. it might be Doctors Townsend and Cloud. They wrote a book, Boundaries: When to Say Yes, How to Say No. And they talk about what happens when we hit adulthood and we haven't had the opportunities to fail and we haven't learned it, and how much harder it is to learn those things as an adult. So I think that's really, really important. So culture shock wise, I mean, obviously I had lots of various things. I will say that with England growing up bicultural and going so often as a child, that I would say I probably was eased into certain things without realizing it. So it was my norm. So I'm trying to think of something that really shocked me. I had moments where something would happen and I would question, is this just this person or is this the culture? When I was living in France. So I had a moment where I had been tutoring and they got really mad at me. And to this day, I do not know what happened. And I had asked them if they could pay me because they hadn't paid me for a few lessons. And I had asked them, could you pay me? Because my parents were coming into town and I didn't have lots of money. And so I just asked if they could pay me before my parents were there. And they had said yes, but then they didn't do anything. So then I followed up and they got really mad that I was asking about it. And freaked me out. Like it was it was a very traumatic experience to be yelled at by an adult in another country, in another language. And then so I'm processing this and I'm like, well, I care more about because I met them through some friends and like they would have me over for dinner, at times, and there was kind of this friendship type connection. And because I was friends with the parents of the man, but my interactions were with the wife. I was like, I wrote them a letter and I just said, look, I wasn't trying to whatever. So I gave them a check back. I didn't cash it. I was so freaked out, like I was shaking. And I kept trying to figure out, is this a cultural thing or is this just this person? And it's interesting to me how when you haven't experienced something in another culture, when you experience it in that culture, it's easy to then associate. And I think this is how stereotypes probably get developed. Like you have one bad experience, you then associate it with whatever language, culture, person, gender, race, whatever, religion that you experience it. And yet it may be not representative of those things at all. And yet it feels like it is because, for instance, I hadn't ever had an adult yell at me as an adult. And even as a child, I didn't have adults yell at me that often, but I hadn't had someone yell at me the way that they did and put me down. So there was this kind of shock to my entire system and trying to sort out, have I done something wrong? Have I broken a cultural standard or norm that I don't know about? Or is this just this person? And if it's just this person, why is this even happening? Like there was so much confusion around that moment.
That's
So
very
that,
that's very tricky. Now, did they respond to your letter?
so it's so weird. So eventually they ended up having me come back. They sent me this message and were like, yeah, come, come back, keep tutoring, whatever. And they pay me something. So then I was like, okay, does this mean that you're now paying me for the other things? I don't know. I asked something. I don't even remember. I probably blacked it out a little bit. It was pretty traumatic for me at the time. And then when I did a few more lessons. I think they paid me for them. And then I was visiting a girlfriend of mine, and out of the blue, I got a text from the same woman saying, "Yeah, don't come back. Have a nice life." And I
Wow.
was just like,
Wow.
okay, okay. I still to this day have I have no idea. It still kind of freaks me out a little bit when I think about it. Like, I probably need to do some trauma healing from that.
But I think you had a very good point there. We often attribute bad experiences to a whole group of people because I guess it's
Yeah,
easier for us to kind of see the whole world in this black and white kind of way, when in reality this was an individual doing
yeah.
that and traumatizing you with their behavior and clearly not being very understanding of then you even apologizing and giving the money back. It's strange. In German, we have the saying, bei Geld hört die Freundschaft auf, meaning the friendship stops when it comes to money. And
Mm, yeah,
some people live by that principle. I mean, it's an old saying. I
yeah,
I consider myself a pretty generous person, and I would say that many of my friends are very generous and that money is usually not a subject, but it's, you know, you bundle up a whole group of people because of a bad experience, and
yeah,
it's just how our human mind works. And I wish we could teach ourselves to think about individuals. Like I always say, when somebody asks me, like, so who do you like and who do you not like? And I always say, I like good people and I dislike bad people. Period. Like that should be the only differentiation we make because it's an individual topic. And even there's a layer of gray there because, there's also the factor of forgiveness and a lot
well,
of
and what's
things.
good and what's bad?
Yep. Yep. Now, can you share, other than this one, because this probably
Yeah,
was impactful, can you share maybe
yeah,
a positive, impactful moment from your time living in France or traveling abroad?
absolutely. And part of what I was going to say is coming back to that idea of your experience with one person.
Hmm.
If that's your only experience with that culture, people group, belief system, whatever, it makes it really hard to have any other perspective. And I think that the more you experience other individuals, you actually begin to realize, oh, this person is a mind. This is not minority in a pejorative way or anything, but just this is a rare occasion. This was just this
Hmm.
one random one off. And
Well, and it's like, you'll have people who, let's say they traveled to Europe, they had a week or two, let's say they went to Germany and they come back and they say, "Oh, I really didn't like it." Well, you were there for a week or maybe 3
yeah,
days, 4 days. So there's
yeah,
also the factor of where did you go? What did you not like? Was it, who was
yeah,
was it a personal thing? Was it the individual? Did that individual just have a bad day? So I feel like we should
yes,
also learn to give people a little more grace and maybe to try to draw our judgment from a multitude of experiences as opposed to going by that one bad experience that we've had.
absolutely. One, it's I often say to Americans, I say, well, how do you feel if somebody came to America and they just went to New York City and Miami? Would you feel that they had experienced America?
Mhm.
And most of the time the answer is like, no.
Of course not. Mhm.
Especially if you're from the Midwest. Like that New York City is a world apart. It's its own culture. It's its own experience, completely independent. Whereas if you hit certain parts of the Midwest, you're likely gonna say, okay, if you have this experience here, you're gonna have a similar experience across the board in the Midwest, most likely. But then again, just like you said, you you ran into that old farmer and he just had a hog die and
Mhm.
got a flat on his tire, his tractor, and blah blah blah. Like he could be having a pretty bad day. And normally he might have been somebody who would have been very happy to chat with you and who would have been interested in where you were from and what was going on in your world. But we all do that. We all fixate on whatever's going on in our world. So it makes perfect sense. So I would say that one of the things that has helped me, like I love France, was the fact that I had so many other wonderful experiences in France. So that one became, especially the more I continued having experiences, it's like, oh yeah, I still don't understand it. And I still don't know if I did something wrong somehow. But I never ever had another experience like that in France, ever. And I have many friends in France who I stay in touch with. And I used to think that if I lived anywhere other than the US, it would be England. Because growing up, of course, that's where my dad's family was. I have a number of friends there. I made friends over the years. And so I always thought that would be where I would end up. But then I lived in France and I'm like, man, I think I would live in France. I lived in southern France and people say, "Oh, they go to Paris and they say the French are not very nice." And the French go to Paris and they say, "Oh, the Parisians are not very nice." And vice versa. There's all these different things, just the way people would feel about New York or different things that people might not like about one part of their own country. The certain things that people like about the city versus the country. All of those things are very different. And for me, I would say that I really loved living in southern France, and I've made some friends for life. We don't talk about the money. No, safety first. But I have been back to see a number of them and would love to do that again. I wouldn't mind living there again and giving my kids that experience. But just so many wonderful things, like a love of the food and the language. And I speak French quite well. So that I'm sure has helped my experience. But sorry, there's a very long-winded way of saying my experience of the French was actually that they were friendly,
Mhm.
which is not the kind of stereotypical impression that I think people have. But I also think when we are open as individuals, that opens doors. And I know people who've come to the US and had great experiences. And then I also know people who ran into the old crotchety guy on a bad day and felt like they didn't have such a great experience. And I'm always so sad when they don't have a great experience. And sometimes I'm like, some of my French connections had said to me, "Oh, we went to Miami and it was just blah blah blah. It was so miserable." And I was just thinking, well, one, what were you guys looking for? What were you expecting? And why is that how you chose to travel? Like, what were you trying to get out of it? And I think a lot of people don't. I think it's easy. I don't want to put this on a lot of people. I think it's easy for us to not think through what we really want. And then we find ourselves disappointed because we haven't actually let ourselves process our own expectations.
Yeah.
And we like to say that we don't have any expectations. I don't think that's true pretty much ever. I think that we always have some expectation. It might be very minimal, but for me, if I go on a date, my minimum expectation is that a man will treat me with respect and will not pressure me for anything and will be pleased that I was willing to meet him. And I don't mean this like, "Oh, I'm gracing you with my presence." But a like, "Hey, you said you were gonna meet and you met." Because in a world of so much ghosting, that's a big deal. Like, I kept my word. So, I think looking at those expectations when we're looking at other cultures and other people, it's like, what am I expecting? And am I expecting certain things? Because I think sometimes we get back what we expect. Like, if we're and so there's two sides to the expectation. One, you can end up with this disappointment, but then kind of this other side of expectation can be, I'm putting out this expectation that they're going to be bad. Well, I'm looking for it to be bad. So I'm anticipating it being negative. So then my focus is already turned towards a negative. I'm that much more likely to find it versus my expectation is turned towards a positive. I'm that much more likely to find it. And you look at how people handle different situations, they you can have two people go through the same situation and one comes out and it was like, "Oh, that was great." And another one comes out and it was like, "That was horrible."
Yeah,
Uh,
we spoke about
yeah.
this earlier, the magic of relationships and how, sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't work out.
Yeah.
How when we're younger, we have this ideal picture of the person we want to spend the rest of our lives with. And then
Mhm.
we get older and we realize, oh, that person doesn't even exist in the wildest Disney dreams. So why am I chasing that? there
Right.
there was a relationship in your life that didn't work out
Mm.
and it ended in a divorce. Can you tell us why it ended, what led to the
Mm.
divorce, and how you view the concept of divorce, especially as a Christian woman?
Yeah. Like, well, I wrote a book. That might be easier to read than like me. I'm gonna try and encapsulate this. So, and you asked about 4 questions there. Can you actually just repeat those for me, Stefan?
Not a problem. Let's perhaps start with that relationship that you had that ended in divorce. Can you tell us a little bit about what the relationship was
Yeah.
like?
Mhm. So, I think I went into it thinking we were on the same. I don't think, I know. I went into it thinking that we were on the same page based on conversations we had, and we did, a marriage counseling thing, which I think is advisable for anyone. But kinda coming back to those expectations, I had this idea in my head that if we said when he said, yes, he wanted to do the same things as me, like, I like doing outreach work, mission work type volunteer work. I was doing a lot more of that then, and he said, "Yeah, yeah," but, he was into that too, and he had done some. I believed him, and after we were married, at one point, I asked him, I said, "Why like, what did you think I meant when I said those things?" Because he wasn't doing it and telling me he didn't want to. And he just said, "Well, I didn't think you really meant it." And I felt flabbergasted because I was just like, what about me ever gave you the impression that I didn't mean what I said? I like to think that if I say I'm going to do something, I do it. And that was confusing. So this I thought that we were aligned. I thought we were on the same page, or else I wouldn't have married him. And I thought we shared some same views and beliefs that were important to me. And as the relationship went on, I found myself feeling so alone. And that was heartbreaking, just the heart wrench of that. And I actually do share my last journal entry, which shares some of that heartache from my first year of marriage. I stopped journaling after that because I realized if you're going to make this work, you can't talk about the dark. You can't talk about this pain. You can't think about this pain because you won't be able to stay in this marriage. And here I am barely a year in and thinking about divorce and thinking how did this happen? How did this experience that's supposed to be so wonderful turn out where I'm in so much pain like all the time? It was very unhealthy and a lot of heartache, a lot of heartache there. So I turned off a lot of those thoughts and was just like, okay, just find a way to make it work. So I pushed and pushed myself and him, and I would try all kinds of things to keep connection. I don't know that I would have used that word at the time, but I look back now and I was like, I was longing for that connection, that friendship, that partner, because I look at marriage as an equal partnership. That's what I want. I'm not interested in something else. So I worked really hard trying to maintain, I would say in some ways what I wanted, but also what I thought it should be. I think sometimes those things are all twisted up together. So at one point he had an affair before our third year anniversary, and I had known he was disconnecting from me, and I didn't know what to do to bring it back. And there was a lot of drinking, there's a lot of other stuff. Like I remember one night getting a phone call from one of his friends. He was still in college at the time. And the guy said, "Hey, you need to come get him because he's too drunk to drive." And it was at midnight or later. And obviously I trusted him. I was very laid back. I was not like I was doing my work and job and stuff and letting him do his stuff and trusted he would whatever. So, sorry, I'm processing a lot right here and I'm trying to make it make sense as I'm sharing this.
All good. Good.
Yeah. And thank you for creating a safe space for me to share this. It's interesting to talk about these things. And I think it's important for people to hear the hard side of things. So the guy called, and I did not feel like it was safe or wise for me to go out there because I didn't know how he would be if he was that drunk. I didn't know how safe it would be for me. And he had never hit me, but I look back now and I'm like, I don't think I had these thoughts, but there was definitely an awareness of I don't know how safe this is and a concern, which I think was a very legitimate concern. So I had called my dad, my brother, and I was like, "Hey, would one of you be willing to come with me? Just so there's somebody else with me." And they were, it's the middle of the night, and they were both like, "No." And so I decided I'm not going to go get him. And that was so hard emotionally in my internal world because I felt like I already felt like I was losing him. And that just took it to this other level of you're letting go
Do you
in a whole
feel,
different way.
sorry to interrupt, but do you feel that
Mm,
you said I already felt like I was losing him? Do you feel like
yeah.
in that conscious moment that it was the choice between losing him or losing yourself?
I certainly didn't think of it that way in the moment. But I look back and it felt very, very dangerous, Stefan. It felt so dangerous. And I don't know that I felt like I would have lost myself, but it was almost like, I mean, maybe that is a good way to say it. I'm processing literally right now. It's not something I think about very often. I'm just going to check in my internal world for a second.
It's okay.
And I'm looking for the right words to articulate this, but I think it felt like I wasn't going to keep feeding into it. I wasn't going to be the backup plan to get him out every time he did whatever. Because there was already stuff going on, already a lot of things. And the word I would use now would be codependence. I I have so many opinions on that, but like I just wasn't going to enable that any further. I wasn't going to be the get out of jail free card. And I felt something shift. And I think it was some of the stuff was already there. He was already in connection with another woman that he would talk to for hours. Like he would be talking to her well into the night, like on the computer or on Facebook. And here I am at home sitting next to him wanting to connect, and he didn't want to connect. Like he would often push me away from him. I would say that was probably the physical, what now I would categorize as physical violence, like
Mhm.
physical aggression, just so I would want to give him a kiss or just be with him. And he would physically push me away from him. Not shoving me, but just like, no, get away. Don't come near me, don't touch me, which was so confusing to my young married mind, a young woman who is wants to have sex and it's like you're rejecting me. I'm not even allowed to do this. And then yeah, so much stuff there.
What
So I
when do you reach the point where you realize that trying your hardest, trying every day just
mm,
isn't enough?
mm. So for me that took a long time. And by long time, so I was married 10 years. The the first affair happened before our third year anniversary. So what I was telling you about with the drinking things and those other things, that was just a few months before. So that was like in the fall. And then I went overseas. I was working for a company out of the UK at the time. And they said, hey, come to the UK, come to London, come come for these business meetings. And then I suggested to my husband, I said, hey, why don't you fly out afterwards? He's a very talented musician. So he was playing in a jazz band or something. I don't know. So they had some performances coming up for the month of December. And he didn't want to miss those. So I said, okay, well, why don't you come when those are over and let's spend Christmas in England with some of my family over there. And, I'm already there. All we have to do is pay for your ticket. You know, to me, that sounds like fun.
Mhm.
So when I was gone is when he took the relationship to a physical level. It had been just emotional before that. And then I found out about it a few months later. So then I'm going through the shock of I've been cheated on and the betrayal and all this fear around that. Like, what are other people going to think about me? How are people going to treat me if they know? And feeling so responsible. I felt like it was my fault. Like you chose to marry him. How did you not see that? How could you have married somebody who would even do this? And just all these things. Like you just didn't love him enough. You somehow it was my fault, right? So
That's just so horrible, and I feel
it
like
is horrible.
a lot of people live through this phase of feeling responsible and feeling inadequate, like blaming yourself for something that this other person is doing when every single day you did nothing but try and try and try to keep it together. And this this worry, how is the
Mm,
world going to judge me, added
mm,
in with all the pain of, let's face it, I mean, there's a grieving period because you married somebody who clearly during that time was a completely different person, at least to you.
yeah, yeah,
That's
I agree.
awful. Let
And I
me
think
just say that I'm very sorry that happened to you and that you had to live through this. And I really hope that your story of getting out of this relationship and the findings and the knowledge that you gain through that process is going to be helpful for some other people, because
mm,
I feel like there are many people who feel stuck in a relationship, and especially, when it comes to religion, there's still a huge stigma on divorce.
Huge. Yeah,
How did you
absolutely. I
how
do know.
how did you reconcile all those emotions and all those thoughts and all those fears?
Mm. So so I found out about the affair stuff, and that was like a bomb, like in my world. Sometimes I look back and I'm like, how did you even survive? Like, it felt like I stopped breathing. That's how it felt. It felt like I just stopped breathing for like 4 or 5 months. And then when I did start breathing, it felt like, okay, how are you going to get through this? And I had said to him, I said, look, do you just want to get a divorce? Like, you want to go be with this woman, then go be with her. Like, do not stay with me because you're afraid of what other people think. Do not stay with me for whatever these reasons are. Stay with me because you want to be with me. He did stay. And I kind of in my head had said in this conversation with God, like, okay, I think I could wait like 5 years because I know that kind of change takes time and effort. And I was willing to do it. I was willing to walk through that and walk through whatever growth he needed and walk through my own growth. So I spent a lot of time working on myself, did a lot of growth myself, and I thought things were getting better. I look back now and I realize, oh, that was just you working on you. And because you were growing, you felt differently. And it felt like maybe we were growing together. We then, like that in year 5, we lived in France for a year. And I thought, oh, things are even better. We're like kind of out of this environment where there were so many stressors that existed where we were at in the US, like the pressures from his family, and there are a lot of kind of like keep up an appearance pressures, maintain the status quo kind of pressure, just superficial, like look and sound good. Doesn't matter if you are good. Don't deal with your actual stuff. Just look good. So we were out of that. But then since then, I've realized, and I spent that whole year, sorry, I'm interrupting my own self. I spent that year just focusing on loving him. Like I actually actually I had prayed about it. I was like, okay, God, what am I doing in this trip? Because I'd felt like the trip was more for my husband, just to get a different experience and maybe make some different music connections that, that was his passion and all these things. So I just felt like God said, just love him. So I just spent the entire year focusing on learning to love him right where he was without expecting change, without like accepting him right where he was with nothing, no other agenda on my part, which I think was a very powerful experience for me to go through. So we came back, and that was like right at the end of what it would have been 5 years. And then unexpectedly got like, I wasn't trying to get pregnant, let's put it that way, got pregnant and had the twins, which that just seemed to reveal even more of kind of the dark, unhealthy behaviors. And there was a moment when the kids were about 5 months old and he's just yelling at them and screaming. And I had this thought, it's like, it's one thing for you to treat me this way, it's another to treat my kids this way. And that moment for me was just like, I began to hit a level of I'm done that I had never hit before. So, so I think that each person's timeline for what does it take for you to realize those things is working on yourself, investing in your own health, your mental and emotional health, building yourself up. And it could happen in a year. In my case, that was over a course of like 7 years. And I think that, especially as a Christian, there's this strong desire for redemption. There's a belief in redemption and in forgiveness and in grace. But what I learned eventually was like, okay, but where's the difference between just some poor behaviors that could be corrected and, oh, I actually don't want to change. And this behavior is abusive, manipulative, controlling behavior that doesn't allow me the freedom to be myself, and separating those things out. And that was a challenging thing. And that's part of what I've done with the book, is trying to help readers separate that so nuanced manipulation and control from, oh, this person's working on themselves and they just need support. Separating those things out. Like, how do you know someone's actually taking responsibility for themselves and their shortcomings and making those steps forward? And the having the kids actually highlighted more of that to me. That definitely kind of brought it to a head. And I was studying, or consuming is a better word, maybe. I was consuming a lot of information about healthy emotions, about mental and emotional health, about relationships. I started reading a book by Lundy Bancroft. Now, this was after I'd been doing counseling for a while and I was considering divorce. I don't know that I could have divorced any sooner than I did. And I say that because I think I might have, I know, because even when I was going through the divorce, I had these doubts of, am, should I give him another chance? Have I done everything? Have I actually done everything? And I think that that's a really hard place to get to, because it always feels like there's something else I could do.
Are you still
But then I'm,
overcome with those thoughts even now? Would you say that you have
no,
moments where you have recollections of him and you're like, well, maybe if I had acted
mm,
differently during that time, or if I had tried harder, those lingering questions, do they
mm,
still come and visit you from time to time?
no, I'm thinking, I'm like, no, pretty much no, they don't. So there was a point in the divorce where I was questioning, like, is there any reason I should consider not divorcing? And I met with some mentors, spiritual leaders in my life, and a couple of pastors, and every single one of them said, no, there's not a single reason you should consider not getting divorced. And here's the thing, especially for any Christian listeners, you can get remarried to the same person. So if that person goes out and changes and chooses to be the person that they've been telling you that they were going to be for years, you can remarry them. But instead of you having your wagon hitched to theirs and being dragged through whatever mud they're going through, you can wait for them to go take care of their stuff and then come back.
Now
And
you're
you don't have to take them back. I'm not saying that. You don't have to, but you can. That's an option. Divorce is not a one-way ticket to hell.
Now one thing you were wondering during this process was,
Mm.
what are people going to say? What did people say?
So I was very fortunate, I think, to be around people who weren't completely of the you don't divorce at any for any reason mind. I was around those people. I actually had a friend say that to me. He's like, I was just raised to believe you just don't ever divorce. And that's not biblical. It's not biblical at all. And yet I think there's a lot of misinformation taught within a number of the different streams of Christianity because, well, I'm not going to go into that. It's a deep, dark well we could go into right there. But so I had people who didn't know how to handle their own emotions and their own reaction to my experience. And now I will say my decision to divorce, not my experience. Most of them did not ask questions about, well, wait a minute, we've known Rachel all our lives. Why would Rachel get a divorce? It didn't feel like people actually asked that question. They just saw, oh, divorce. Oh, we shouldn't divorce. Oh, freak out. That's how it felt. A lot of people a lot of people didn't say anything to me, and I think that they just had a number of people just disconnect from me. Like, they just didn't speak to me. So I don't think they know how to handle it and what to think and how to process it. And then I did have people who were supporting me. I can't imagine what it would have been like to have no one support me, but fortunately my immediate pastors were supportive, and I had a number of friends who were very supportive of that and who were encouraging me. And the thing that I always say is it's not about if it's right or wrong. It's about if it's healthy or unhealthy. Because when we fixate on it being right or wrong, we treat it as though it's a sin. And yet for those people who are in that Christian community, the Bible makes allowances for divorce for a number of reasons. And most of them are because the marriage isn't healthy. They're not being treated well. They're not being treated well. That's one of the top things. It's not having an affair. I mean, that did happen to me, but that was not the reason that I ultimately divorced. It was the verbal, mental, and emotional abuse and treating my children a certain way and not choosing to take responsibility for himself. Like what I wanted was a partner who took responsibility for himself. And I didn't have that. And I kept hoping that would change. I kept hoping for that. And now I do hope he still makes those changes, but not as my partner. I hope he does it just because I think it would be a healthy choice for him. And I would like him to be happy. And I would like him to be able to enjoy his relationships, his relationship with the kids, whatever relationships he has. Like I want him to be healthy and whole, but now I'm not facing all the consequences of each thing he chooses.
How is your relationship with him? You obviously have children together, so I'm sure you
Yeah.
still have interactions. How are those?
So I try to have as few as possible. So there's no evidence, the indication that I've seen that he's dealt with some of those bigger items until then. Like it's not like you don't co-parent with someone who is focused on themselves. And I see a lot of narcissistic behavior when I talk to a lot of women, and I do see this sometimes where the woman is narcissistic and is the man. It's flip flopped, but majority statistically, it's male to female manipulation and control. So I just lost my little train of thought there. My little train. Where was I going? I was like, it just went zzz.
It
Say
it's
the question to me
it
again.
sounds it sounds to me like you have a lot of hope for him, but that from what you from what you can tell right now, he's not necessarily doing all the work that he should be doing.
Yeah, the work of change takes a lot of effort and it takes self awareness and awareness of how this impacts other people. I don't see that. And you cannot, this is where I was going. Thank you. You cannot co parent with someone who's narcissistic. So whether or not, and obviously I'm very careful to, I'm not going to call someone a narcissist. There can be a very specific diagnosis for that, but they can still exhibit narcissistic behavior. And you can identify that. You cannot co-parent with someone in that place because everything still comes back to them. Everything still comes back to how does this serve them? What do they gain? And so you often see this interaction with the children or with the other spouse. And it's like half the time, the interactions with the kids come back to trying to manipulate and control the ex spouse, which that's not making the children a priority. And so, they're usually very, very good at it, where it's really hard for other people unless you are aware of certain abuse styles and tactics and you've learned about trauma and some of those things, you're probably not going to recognize it because you haven't learned about that yet. That's something that I feel pretty strongly about us as a society increasing our education on so that people recognize, oh, wait a minute, that's gaslighting. Oh, wait a minute. What's their priority here? It's actually not the kids. It's actually them being in control. How do they gain control? What strings are they trying to pull here to do that? So we communicate about changes to the schedule. And that's about it. There's not a lot else. And some of the big things for me are equipping my kids. Like when him or his family ask my kids questions, I'm like, look, if that's about me or our life, that's actually none of their business. You can just say to them, oh, if you want to know more about that, you need to ask mom. You can ask my mom. Because that whole thing where families would try and manipulate the children, I don't want my children to be pawns in it. If I want to say something to my ex, I will say it to him. I am not going to have my kids be go-betweens because they will do that. They'll try and get the kids to say things to me to either guilt trip me or get me to, agree to something that it's like, hey, we are not doing that. So, yeah, there's not really what I would consider a relationship as far as I'm not going to get his opinion on decisions I'm making. I'm not going to process those things with him. And I recommend to my friends and my clients, like, this is not the person you process with anymore. But most of the time, if you were in a manipulative, controlling, abusive relationship, you've probably been brainwashed to some level where you feel the need to explain every decision you make and justify it, give all the reasons why, blah, blah, blah. And most of the time, if they just say one thing, a lot of what I see is women and myself included, especially women. That's why I'm making the caveat. Like, I don't know so much about with men because I don't have as many male friends who are telling me their experiences about this. But it's like I'll just say everything and explain myself. I don't do that so much anymore. I probably don't do it at all now. But this pressure to I'm trying let me give you an example. It used to be that I would process everything and let him know everything I was doing. And then when we're divorced, there was one time I was getting ready to do something with the kids. This is shortly after the divorce. And he says, "Where are you going? Where are you taking them?" That's actually none of his business. Like, I don't have to tell him legally in our stuff, whatever. Um, I just realized I say whatever a lot. So you don't have to tell him, but he asked me, "Where are you taking him?" And I instantly told him where I was taking him, why I was taking him, what we were planning to do, all this stuff. And I thought, whoa, you have been trained to
Mhm.
give him an update on all the information. So he knows everything that's happening in your world and you know nothing about his, which is how it was for quite a while in the marriage, but I didn't realize it. So now that I'm out of it and he's not like, he doesn't need to know those things. So in my head, I know it's none of his business, but I'm not generally somebody who would say that's none of your business. I didn't know how to say something like that in a way that was still honoring and respecting the person who I want to be. So I don't want to be rude. I don't know how to say. To me, saying it's none of your business feels very, very rude. So that was a real challenge for me. And one of the things I learned to do was to ask questions. So that instance, I didn't do it. Just blurted out all the information. He can know every detail of my life. And he, side note, had no problem saying to me if I asked something, well, that's none of your business, even if it was actually kind of my business because it was related to the kids in some way. But now I've learned to ask questions like, oh, why do you ask? Because it might be that he's asking for something that, oh, maybe this is the reason why he's asking, and I can answer that question. And that question is relevant for some reason. Like if it was like, oh, well, I was wondering about changing this date and I wanted to know if you guys were going to be back. Well, then he should have asked that.
But how powerful for you to reclaim ownership of your
Mm,
choices. And
absolutely.
I I'm very sure that going from parenting with somebody to becoming a single parent and having to do everything on your own cannot always have been easy.
Hmm.
What were some of the challenges you faced, and how did you overcome those?
Yeah. And I'll say, if you're in a relationship with someone who's not healthy and is pretty toxic and not working on themselves, you're probably already single parenting. I had a couple of interactions with people where they asked me, I was talking about doing something with the kids, and I was like, "Oh," whatever I had said, and they said, "Well, Rachel, are you married?" And I was like, Yes." Like, why are they asking me this? And it really hit me, because the kids were they were 2 when I filed for divorce. So, there was 2 years there. And I realized, because everything I said and did, I talked about doing alone. Because even though I was married, I was already single parenting. But there was somebody there who helped on occasion, but it wasn't what it would be like with a partner who viewed me as an equal and who valued me and respected me and wanted to do life with me. So, in some ways, Stefan, I would say that I've been doing it for so long, I didn't even know. I have a hard time envisioning what it would look like to be with a really healthy partner who would partner with me to parent and who would share the workload that comes with parenting. I mean, you are a single parent, you know how much work it is. It's a lot of work because you're managing the emotions of 3 people. Like, obviously, we're not doing all of it for them, but we're trying to help them learn that. And anytime you go on a trip, you're helping prepare the clothes, the food for 3 people. And obviously, that shifts from as their ages change, how much you're doing and etcetera, but you're still there taking that responsibility, and that could be shared with someone. So I would say I have a hard time separating what's single parenting versus what isn't, because I was doing a lot of it from the beginning. And then, of course, having twins, just that's such an intense experience, such an intense experience. I did have help. My mom helped a lot, but I'm just trying to think if there is something. I can't think of something.
And that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, what is your romantic life like now? Obviously, being a single parent doesn't make it very easy
Yeah.
to date anyway.
Great.
And then we have reached a certain age where the pool of potential candidates is shrinking. How do you handle dating, and what are the things you look for in a
Mm,
person for you to date?
yeah. So I think it's really fun to be dating at this age. Like, I used to be terrified. I was like, "Oh my gosh, you're gonna hit 40 and you're single parent. Nobody's gonna want you." Um, and
Not
now,
true. Not true.
not true. Absolutely not true. You're right. It's been a shock to my system, because when I was married, my husband was kind of the mindset, and this is, I know this is the common mindset for certain groups of men. Like, you have to be thin to be beautiful, and if you're not skinny, basically you're not attractive. And I gained weight over the years, which I look back and I now realize it was a protection, because he was rejecting me all the time, and it was like, well, that doesn't make sense. Let's justify the rejection. So yeah, anyway, that's a whole other thing. But it's been interesting to realize that men of a far wider age range than I would have anticipated find me attractive. And I'd say the biggest thing for me is finding people who really value and respect others and have done the hard work on themselves. Like, that's what I'm looking for. I'm also very sapiosexual. I really find intelligence very attractive. I find emotional and mental health attractive. People who know themselves and can articulate it. Men who like to read books. I'm like, dang it, they'll get me with that one. A guy puts on his profile. If he puts on his profile that he reads, I'm like, ooh, message that one.
Or you just have to make Barnes and Noble your dating destination.
Yes, exactly. I was like, why is there not a book dating app? Like,
Hmm.
here's the app for all the people who love books, and here's the things we love, and then can we meet and talk about that? Yeah. So I I am still on online dating apps. They're really just meet apps, like introduction apps is probably what they should call them, because you're not dating and you might go on a date, but a lot of times you're just going on meets. Like, let's just meet each other in person and see if we're as attracted to each other as we think we are based on our online text or voice conversation. So I would and still enjoy meeting a great partner. I think that would be awesome, but I kind of hold it with like an open hand of I'm not gonna be so latched onto the idea of I don't feel like I have to find a partner. I think
Hmm.
it would be great if I met one, if that makes sense. Like kind of the difference in the energy there between I have to find this person and
And how
just the
awesome
joy.
to have that pressure gone, right? To not
Yeah.
be I have friends who feel like they have to be in a relationship at all times. And then
Mm,
when relationships end, they're like desperately looking for the next person. And I feel like it's so much healthier, like you said, it would be nice to have a relationship, but to not have this pressure that you have to have one within the next 5 minutes.
yeah.
I think that's wonderful. Now, the first test that a potential mate would have to pass is, since you mentioned the books, there is a special book that that person could read to get to know you a little bit better. Can you
Yeah.
tell us more about your book and how people can find out more about you?
Yes. And just as you said that, I thought, well, that could be a weird introduction to me. Here, read this book I wrote about divorce, and then maybe we'll consider dating.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, it's got a lot of good stuff. And I think that also to your point about people just jumping into a relationship, I think it's really, really important that each person take the time to know themselves and know who you are without a partner, without someone else in the picture. That is one of the greatest gifts I think you can give yourself and the world. So my book is called Blueprints for Divorce: An Act of Love, Sacrifice, and Redemption. And I wrote the book that I wish had existed when I was going through all my years of marriage and the heartbreak and the heartache that I went through. And there was so much pain in my marriage. Divorce itself was painful and hard and scary, but my marriage was painful and hard and it hurt. So the book is divided into three main parts and then a conclusion section. So the first part is focusing on like what do we believe about divorce? What do we think about divorce? How do we talk about divorce? And trying to really address these ideas. I even often use the term getting unmarried as opposed to divorce. Like people kind of get tripping on the word divorce, and I think that that's unhealthy, especially within a Christian community. There's so many views on that. I There is a number of like I've dug into some of the scripture stuff. I don't that's not the book is not an exegesis of the scriptures, but I do include those things and talk about, hey, this is where these ideas are coming from, and here are things that you're facing that are coming from society and certain groups. And what if we shifted our terminology, just like I mentioned earlier, from good and bad, wrong or right, to healthy or unhealthy? Like, what happens when you reframe your perspective on this topic? And then I go into the second part is how do you figure out if you should divorce? Like, is your divorce healthy? What do healthy relationships look like? What do unhealthy relationships look like? And how do you distinguish those nuanced things? Like how are you going to know that your spouse, they said they're going to do these things? How do you know they're doing them? How do you know that they're actually changing and working on themselves? How do you detect that? And then the third part is really focused on building yourself up, because whatever decision you make, you're probably losing yourself in a relationship, especially if there's elements of manipulation and control there. So, building yourself up to a point where you can actually take a deep breath and look at the situation. I'm just thinking, as saying that, I'm picturing those moments when, if it is a toxic relationship, everything is on high alert. You're almost always going to have your body activated into that fight or flight mode. And because you live in that constant state of the stress being high, it's very hard to take a deep breath and take a step back and look at the situation without that filter present. It's I would say almost impossible. But trying to building yourself up will create a little bit more of that space to look at that relationship and be at a place where you can make a decision that you can feel good about, as opposed to you've just been pressured into it because you've been dealing with all these issues for so long that it's normal and you can no longer tell the difference, which is part of what I went through. And then the conclusion, it's kind of a choose your own adventure because I acknowledge that you can stay with the status quo, change nothing. That's one option. The other two options are you can stay, but now hopefully the person is equipped with some information on how to watch for that change and how to keep an eye out for the markers and know that their partner really does want to partner and is willing to do the hard work on themselves to be a healthy partner. And then the third one is, hey, I think it's time for me to move on. And that is really scary. So those two options, there's a chapter for them, depending on what they choose, that goes into greater detail on, hey, you want to stay? Here's some things to think about, and here, to equip you to stay and watch for those things. And then, oh, you want to leave? Here are some things to get started. And then I'm currently editing I've called it the Blueprints for Divorce Practical Guidebook, which is for people who are deciding to go ahead and move forward with getting unmarried, that it gives them further support in what they're about to face and journey. And that's something that they can sign up for on my website. And as soon as I'm done editing, I will send it out to them as an EPUB booklet that they can put on their device or whatever digital reader they use.
Perfect. Perfect. I think something that I would like to mention is that I wish that people going through relationships that are not working out could shake off the shame and the guilt
Yeah.
that they carry so deeply within, because there's two people in a relationship and you cannot control what the other person does. And
No,
of course, you should try in a relationship, but you cannot try alone. Both people have to actually make an effort to make things work. And
absolutely.
if they don't anymore, then for your own mental health sake, for your, if kids are involved, for the sake of the kids, divorce can be the right and healthy option.
100%.
Rachael, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for talking to me, for spending some time with me and my listeners today. And if people want to reach out to you, they can find more information in the show notes. So thank you very, very much for being here today.
Thank you, Stefan.
It was a pleasure to have you join us today, my dear ThoughtVolutionists. Now, as we draw near the close of this profound episode of ThoughtVolution, I find myself in awe of the depth and richness of Rachael's journey, an odyssey marked by resilience, authenticity, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. Rachael's story serves as a profound reminder of the transformative power of vulnerability, self-awareness, and the courage to embrace one's own authentic self. From navigating the complexities of cultural differences to reframing societal norms within the Christian community, Rachel's journey is a testament to the human spirit's capacity for growth, compassion, and the deeply genuine connections we make with our fellow human beings. Through Rachel's insights and reflections, we are all invited to embark on our own journeys of self-discovery and personal growth. Her willingness to confront taboo topics, challenge misconceptions, and foster sacred self-awareness offers a source of hope and inspiration to all who dare to tread the path of authenticity and truth. As we bid farewell to Rachael and her powerful wisdom that is so deeply rooted in her very own lived experiences, let us carry forward the lessons she has so generously shared with us today. May her stories of love, loss, and redemption serve as guiding lights on our own journeys, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, there's always, at the very least, a flicker of hope waiting to be ignited within our souls. Now, before we part ways today, I want to take a moment to address a topic that Rachael bravely shared in our conversation: divorce, or, as she so rightfully put it, getting unmarried. In some communities, divorce carries with it a heavy burden of shame, fear, and guilt. But Rachel's journey reminds us that divorce can also be a healthy option for individuals seeking to reclaim their autonomy, their happiness, and their sense of self-worth. Let us collectively challenge the stigma surrounding divorce and create spaces of compassion, understanding, and support for those navigating this deeply personal journey. This is ThoughtVolution, where every conversation is an invitation to explore the depths of the human experience, to embrace vulnerability, and to celebrate the beauty of authenticity. Join us as we continue to journey together, one heartfelt conversation at a time. And I'll see you next time, my dear, dear, dear ThoughtVolutionists. I love you lotsies.